I left the Navy after 23 years, 2 decades of metal decks, salt spray that tasted like duty, and staring at the horizon through steel railings. And when I finally hung up the uniform, all I wanted was quiet. True, unearned peace. That's why I bought the old clapboard cottage on the bluffs of Sandpoint Bay, right on the edge where the land gives way to the Pacific. It was weathered, sure, but it felt right, you know? It felt like the end of a long voyage and the beginning of a long, slow exhale that I didn't buy it just for the view. Though it was spectacular, I bought it for the water, but the kind of water that didn't demand a tactical report or a readiness drill. I wanted the tide to move because of the moon, not because of a deployment schedule. So, the first thing I did, the very first thing after unpacking the boxes, was plant the trees. Not some fussy ornamental stuff, either. These were warriors, coastal live oaks, black mangroves, resilient saltbush. Species that had a history with this sandy, eroding soil that I planted them low, right along the bluff's edge, spaced them out perfectly, and anchored the base with native grasses, building what I thought of as my personal, living fortress. It took years for the sentinel oaks to truly take hold. Anyone who says a few shovelfuls of dirt and a hose is all it takes for coastal vegetation to thrive hasn't done it. It's a slow war against the elements, but watching those roots braid themselves into the earth, knitting the bluff together like a strong, green sweater, it was the most satisfying work I'd ever done. They weren't just decorations. They were guardians, breaking the wind, anchoring the land, and honestly, anchoring my own restless heart. Neighbors, the old school ones, they loved it. They'd stop their walks and ask about the growth rate or the species name. I even had a city environmental agent, a guy named Dr. Silas Thorne, come out and walk the line with me one afternoon, and he just shook his head and gave me the highest compliment a guy like me could ask for. He said, "Ethan, you haven't built a garden. You've built a Class A, bioengineered seawall. You're thinking long-term." That's what I wanted, something lasting, something living. And that, of course, is what made it hurt so much when the new guard moved in. For years, the Sandpoint Bay Homeowners Association, the HOA, was basically a neighborhood newsletter with a budget for block parties. The president was usually some retired history teacher or a kind old real estate agent who just wanted to make sure nobody left an old sofa out on the curb for 2 weeks. We paid our modest dues, we waved, we lived our lives. That system worked because the board understood the difference between community management and outright control. And then, about 6 months ago, Veronica Sterling arrived. Veronica and her husband built this monstrosity, a custom-built, razor-sharp, white stucco house perched on the highest point of the hill. All wraparound glass, screaming coastal minimalism, looking directly down onto the entire neighborhood, and straight onto my trees. The very first time I encountered her, she was strutting down the sidewalk, designer sunglasses perched just so, a clipboard and an iced coffee in hand, sizing up my front yard like it was a crime scene. "Mr. Riley," she began, not even bothering with a hello or a handshake, just tapping a lacquered nail on her clipboard. "Are you aware that your border planting exceeds the C4 height covenant for oceanfront parcels by almost 2.5 feet?" I laughed. I couldn't help it. Not a mocking laugh, just a surprised exhale. "Look, Veronica," I told her, "I've been here 12 years, and my hedge hasn't moved an inch, and neither has anyone's opinion on it until this morning." Her smile, if you could call it that, didn't reach her eyes. It was tight, surgical. "Well, I'm saying something now," she replied, sharp as a box cutter. She hadn't even finished furnishing her home, and she was already running for HOA president. 3 weeks of glossy flyers, talking about property value preservation and unified aesthetic harmony. Most people, including me, didn't bother voting. She still won in a landslide. Uncontested, AT first, I told myself. Let her fuss over trash can lid colors. I have the ocean. I have the sea air. I have my coffee and the rustle of the wind through the Sentinel Oaks. But it wasn't long before the letters started arriving. The first one was just folded in half, shoved into my mailbox like a passive-aggressive note from a former friend. Notice of severe vegetation encroachment. Printed on new, heavy, ivory HOA letterhead, of course, with Veronica's signature at the bottom, citing a new clause about unauthorized plantings interfering with neighborhood sight lines and collective sea vistas. I walked the bluff line the next morning. My trees were healthy, their bark rough, their roots a dense, protective cage around the soil. It was scientifically obvious. Without them, this land would literally crumble into the bay, inch by inch. I had years of documentation, consultation reports from a coastal engineer I'd paid 5 figures for, maps, photos. So I compiled it all. I typed up a polite, detailed rebuttal and slipped it under the newly installed, high-security HOA office door. 2 weeks later, the response was a second notice, this time with a fine attached. $50 a day, retroactive to the date of the first letter. I stood on my porch, the sea perfectly flat and blue, holding that fine, and that's when I had the strange, cold realization. Veronica didn't see my trees as an obstruction. She saw them as an act of defiance. Something she didn't plant, didn't control, and couldn't look over. It wasn't about views or bylaws anymore. It was about dominance. And having seen real dominance played out in the military, I knew just how dangerous that kind of petty, unchecked power could be. Especially in someone who had never had to sacrifice anything or listen to a serious warning. I tucked the notice into a file folder labeled "V Nonsense," walked down the path, and put my hand on the rough bark of the tallest oak, the first one I'd planted. "They are not taking you," I muttered. "I promise." It's truly amazing how quickly neighborly relations can pivot to something adversarial. Veronica hadn't just taken over the HOA. She'd rebranded it as her personal instrument of control. She called it elevating the coastal aesthetic. I called it a war on the neighborhood's character. Her house was pure modern architecture, sharp, white lines, wide windows, and this ridiculously tall, absurdly clean flagpole that managed to fly a starched flag even when there wasn't a breath of air. I saw her out there at 6 a.m. once, using a leaf blower to push sand off her immaculate white driveway. Veronica Sterling didn't believe in nature. She believed in total subjugation. Once she was in charge, she created 5 new subcommittees: architectural fidelity, visual harmony, infrastructure review, and my favorite, the Vista Optimization Task Force. She filled them with people who wore matching tennis outfits, people who complained about the shade from their neighbor's awning, and people who had clearly never had to sandbag their own property against a rising tide. And right at the top of their priority list, my Sentinel Oaks. The hostility was crystal clear during the first community meeting she chaired, held in the newly revamped clubhouse, which now smelled of lavender cleaner and had gluten-free catering. I sat in the back, arms crossed, watching her click through a PowerPoint presentation titled, "Reclaiming Our Sandpoint Heritage." Slide after slide showed open lawns, unobstructed ocean views, pristine fences. Then came a slide labeled "Ecological Infractions," and there, zoomed in just enough to make them look like jungle overgrowth, was a photo of my Sentinel Oaks. "This," she announced, aiming her laser pointer like a rifle sight at my trees, "not only blocks the collective enjoyment of our most valuable asset, the ocean, but it also fails to comply with the height standards listed under Section 8C of the Coastal Uniformity Policy, ratified just last week." I calmly raised my hand. She blinked at me, annoyed by the interruption. "Yes, Mr. Riley? That grove predates the new HOA board, Veronica," I said, my voice steady. "They were planted with county environmental approval back in 2013. They protect this bluff from collapse. Without them, you're going to watch your pristine new fences slide right into the bay by spring." A few quiet coughs and nervous shuffles rippled through the audience. Veronica stiffened. "I've reviewed the file, Ethan," she said with that same tight, fake smile. "There was no recorded variance request submitted to the HOA regarding that planting. Therefore, it constitutes an unapproved alteration to common-facing coastal boundaries. They are on my private property." I shot back. "And I have the notarized deed and aerial surveys to prove it." Her smile held, but her voice dropped half an octave. "Dangerous now. Mr. Riley, the HOA exists to protect the collective values of the entire community. While we appreciate your contribution to the ecosystem, we cannot allow one homeowner's decisions to diminish the harmony we all strive for. If these trees were to be removed, I assure you, no lasting damage would occur." I let out a single, stunned laugh. "No lasting damage. You're talking about coastal hardwoods that took a decade to sink their roots deep enough to be effective, Veronica. You remove those, and you're pulling the thread out of a sweater when the temperature is dropping below freezing. She turned back to her projector, refusing to respond. That night, I received a new letter, hand-delivered, along with a glossy trifold brochure inviting me to voluntarily participate in the Landscape Optimization Initiative. I politely declined. 2 days later. The morning after didn't feel like morning at all, just a wet, metallic gray stillness. No birdsong, just the groan of broken wood and the faint echo of sirens trying to find roads that no longer existed. When I stepped outside, my boots sank into soaked earth. My bluff had receded by a solid 4 feet. The ground ended earlier than it had the day before, and the deep scar ran along where the largest coastal oak had once stood. Its stump was gone now, swept clean out, but that wasn't the worst of it. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of what remained of Veronica's house and what didn't. Her entire backyard was obliterated. The sleek fencing was gone, reduced to twisted metal. Her wraparound balcony hung awkwardly from the structure like a broken jaw. The wall of glass that gave her that ocean vista was nothing but glittering shards embedded in the wet carpet and sand. The sea hadn't just visited. It had entered, claimed its price. I spotted Veronica herself moments later. She was slumped on the curb near the ruined clubhouse, soaked to the skin, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes bloodshot and unfocused. Her pristine white blouse was torn at the shoulder, streaked with mud. Her hair, usually shellacked into place, hung wet and limp across her cheeks. She wasn't talking, not to anyone. A man from the board, looking terrified, stood over her, repeating her name in a low, anxious tone. But Veronica just sat there, rocking slightly, like a child who had seen too much horror. Half the neighborhood had gathered, standing in clumps, whispering, staring in disbelief at the destruction that had once been the pride of the HOA, the symbol of their order. Now it looked like a war zone. The clubhouse wall was entirely gone, the interior furniture floating in a pool of water mixed with office paper and dirt. Nobody had to say it out loud. The bluff had failed. Structurally, foundationally, symbolically. Eventually, a firefighter gently lifted Veronica to her feet and guided her into the back of a medical van, probably to be checked for shock. I didn't approach her. I didn't need to, because in that moment, as she looked back one final time at the wreckage, I saw the exact second it hit her. The gravity of the consequences, the chain of events, the letters, the trees, the bluff, the terrible, undeniable truth. It washed over her face just like the sea had washed over her house. She collapsed, not from exhaustion, but from the brutal realization that she had unleashed something far more powerful than herself. Later that afternoon, the city dispatched a structural safety team. They didn't need any fancy equipment to see what had happened. The erosion patterns were clear. The storm surge had chewed right through the weakest point, Veronica's lot, and once the natural defenses were gone, there was nothing to slow it down. The water had rushed in, unimpeded, and punched through everything in its path. I approached one of the inspectors. "You see the grove that used to be over there?" I asked, pointing toward my side of the bluff. That was a living seawall, held the slope together for over a decade. The man nodded, writing on his tablet. "Yeah, we've seen this before. Natural buffers removed to beautify the view. Always ends the same way, man. You're the owner of this parcel." "I am." He looked up at me, grimly. "You are lucky you still have a parcel." I didn't say anything. That evening, I returned to what was left of my backyard, my hands running along the torn edges of exposed earth. I dropped to one knee and pressed my palm into the dirt, just to feel it, just to connect to something that was once mine. I stayed there long enough for the wind to calm, long enough for the ocean to stop roaring and start breathing again. When I finally stood up, the sun was setting, a flat, red orb bleeding into the waterline. It cast long shadows across the bluff, and in those shadows, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't rage anymore. It wasn't even grief. It was purpose. Because now, everyone had seen what I tried to warn them about. Now they knew. Veronica's reputation was shattered, her voice silenced by consequence. But mine was just beginning to carry weight. The neighborhood started crawling with reporters, engineers, and environmental auditors. The sheriff's office roped off the entire bluff. I watched from my porch as a Channel 5 reporter stared open-mouthed at the mangled metal that used to be the HOA's brand-new bike rack. But it wasn't the wreckage that drew the biggest crowd the next morning. It was Veronica. She emerged from her house around 9 a.m., surrounded by two board members who looked like they wanted to vanish into the cracked pavement. Her face was blotchy, exhausted. Gone was the crisp white blouse and the perfect bun. Today, she wore a loose raincoat and mud-soaked shoes. Her hands trembled as she clutched a wrinkled sheet of paper. She walked up to the ruined clubhouse steps, stopped at the podium they used for neighborhood barbecues, and leaned toward the microphone, her voice hoarse and cracked. "I want to start by saying I never intended for anyone to be hurt," she began. "I truly believed we were doing what was best for the neighborhood. We thought the trees were unsightly. We had concerns about uniformity. But I see now," her voice caught, "that those trees were holding this land together. They were doing more than we understood." The crowd was dead silent. "Mr. Riley warned us many times. We didn't listen." She paused, her eyes searching the crowd until they found me. And when they did, she looked like a woman who had finally realized she'd been standing on a trap door her whole life. "I made a mistake," she said. "A terrible one." Tears slid down her cheeks, streaking dried salt and dirt. "I'll step down from the board immediately. I'll cooperate with the investigation, and I pray, that one day you will all see I was just trying to do what I thought was right." She stepped back, shoulders crumbling inward. She wasn't a tyrant anymore. She was just a broken woman, vanquished not by a lawsuit, but by the overwhelming, unforgiving power of the natural world. Nobody clapped. Nobody booed. There was only silence. She walked away without fanfare, vanishing into her damaged house with the gait of someone who would never return to public life. The fallout was immediate. City engineers issued a formal report confirming that the removal of the natural barrier, Mycenial Grove, had significantly weakened the bluff, calling it an avoidable failure, exacerbated by unauthorized ecological disturbance. The HOA board tried to pivot, but the damage was too public, too obvious that I got a call from the State Coastal Conservation Office. The director, Elaine Nichols, had reviewed my decades of permits and surveys. "You did everything right, Ethan," she said. "You tried to warn them. We'd like to use your property as a pilot site, restoration, coastal defense, education. Would you be open to that?" I was quiet for a long time. "Finally," I said, "as long as no one plants another sign that says view obstruction." She laughed. "I think we've all learned that lesson." The city attorney opened a formal inquiry into the HOA's finances and conduct. The final blow came a week later when Channel 5 aired a follow-up segment, "From Views to Vulnerable: How One HOA Undermined Its Own Shoreline." They closed with a slow zoom on Veronica's shattered backyard, then cut to me standing by the edge of my land, newly reinforced with erosion netting and stakes. The anchor's final words resonated. "Sometimes the strongest walls aren't made of concrete. They're grown. And sometimes the loudest warnings don't come from agencies, but from neighbors who simply know better." That night, I didn't feel victorious, but I felt deeply vindicated. By late autumn, the green was returning to the bluff. New saplings, black mangroves, saltbush, and Yayan holly stood like cautious survivors in the soil, not as mighty as the grove that came before, but present, resilient. And without the iron grip of the HOA board, something strange took root in its place: cooperation. Real neighbors talking to one another, gathering on porches and front lawns with dogs barking and kids running barefoot. The control had crumbled like Veronica's glass wall, and in its place, we found something older, more human. The Sentinel Oaks were gone, but their legacy was just beginning. That winter, the city passed new regulations prohibiting any HOA from removing shoreline vegetation without a certified environmental impact study. The Riley Clause. They called it. One morning, I received a call. The governor's office saw the report, Nichols said. "They want to fund a statewide awareness campaign on natural shoreline defenses. We'd like you to be the face of it." I stood on my bluff, still recovering, still fragile, but alive. I nodded to no one in particular and whispered, "Yeah, let's do it." I never asked for an apology from Veronica. I didn't need one. She got her consequence, and I got something better: dignity restored, and land that could finally breathe again. The sea stayed quiet. Every now and then, it still swells. That's its nature, but I've learned to read it better. And it, in turn, respects the bluff again. Because we've rebuilt with patience and care, not ego. A few weeks ago, I walked out with a thermos of coffee and stood at the edge, boots on firm soil. An old neighbor, Sam, who used to glare at my trees, joined me. I thought those things were weeds, he admitted, nodding toward the new saplings. Now I wish we'd planted more. I passed him the thermos. We're still planting, Sam. You know, he said, smiling at the horizon where the morning sun was cutting through the fog like gold through silk. I think the sea forgives faster than people do. Maybe, I replied. But people eventually learn. The sea never needed to. Later that week, I built a small wooden sign at the